Good afternoon. My name is GRZEGORZ Ekiert, and I'm a professor of government here at Harvard and associate of the Center for European Studies. And we are very fortunate today to have Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland, RADOSLAW Sikorski. And we are very grateful that you were able to find time in your schedule to visit Harvard. Before I introduce Minister Sikorski, I would like to mention a couple of things about the nature of the event. This is the August Zaleski Lecture in Modern Polish History. And August Zaleski was was Polish scholar, diplomat, and Minister of Foreign Affairs in several governments. He was also the president of Poland in exile after 1945, where Polish government in exile was not recognized by any government. I would like to thank Mrs. Marina Weintraub, who is the founder of Zaleski Lecture, and also to Tricia Craig and the Center for European Studies for all the efforts to make this event happen. I also like to thank you, Professor Terry Martin and the Davis Center for Russian and East European Studies for co-sponsoring the event, and to Krzysztof Daniewski, who is president of Harvard Club of Poland, for co-sponsoring the event. Now, Zaleski Lectures were designed to bring to Harvard students of Polish history. And Professor Szporluk, who coordinated Zaleski Lectures for many years, brought all the most important scholars of Polish history to Harvard. So now we are experimenting with bringing not only important students of history, but the makers of Polish history. And I think that, that our guest today really belongs to that category, the makers of Polish history. We have other people in the room I would like to acknowledge today, and most of all, Mr. Robert Kupiecki, who is the Polish ambassador to the US, and Mrs. Ewa Jurczyk-Ziomecka, who is Polish Consul General in New York. RADOSLAW Sikorski is a distinguished politician, policy expert, and journalist. He left Poland in 1981 and moved to England, where he studied philosophy, social science, and politics in Pembroke College at Oxford University. In 1986 and 89, he worked as a reporter covering wars in Afghanistan and Angola. He returned to Poland in 1989 and had a number of influential positions in different Polish governments. He was the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs under Jerzy Buzek. In 2002, he spent 2 years in Washington in American Enterprise Institute and returned to Poland in 2005 to become the Minister of Defense, and then in 2007, the Minister of Foreign Affairs in the government of Donald Tusk. After several years of self-inflicted turmoil, Poland finally has a constructive foreign policy. And the Minister Sikorski is the architect of that transformation. As economists mentioned in a recent article, it is in its foreign policy, Poland has chosen realism over romanticism. And I think this really reflects the way in which the Polish foreign policy develops. So Poland regained its position as the trusted and important member of the European Union. Poland improved its relations with Russia and restored special relations with Germany and France through resurrection of the Weimar Triangle. And finally, Poland has kept its commitment to transatlantic relations. As again, economists stated once, it is perhaps the first time in its history Poland has a good relations with Germany, Russia, and America at the same time. Today, Minister Sikorski will speak on European security. Does it still matter to the US? Welcome.
Thank you, Professor. Ladies and gentlemen, In 1923, Polish Lieutenant General Józef Haller visited here in Boston. He came here to thank Polish-American volunteers who had fought in the First World War under his command. Poland, supported by President Woodrow Wilson, had regained its international voice. As August Zaleski wrote in his Landmarks of Polish History, that voice had long been silenced by its neighbors. It's a great honor for me to give this lecture here at Harvard in memory of August Zaleski. Zaleski served twice as Poland's Minister of Foreign Affairs. He was also president in exile when Poland was under Soviet domination. It was said that he was one of the most taciturn ministers of foreign affairs that Europe had ever known. Well, he had plenty of reasons to be taciturn. Inspired by him, I intend not to be quite so taciturn. I want to talk about European security, why it matters to Poland, why it matters to me, why it should matter to you. When I was your age, we had a different sort of security in Europe. It was the pseudo-security of the Cold War, of barbed wire fences, of people being gunned down for trying to move from one part of Berlin to another, of secret police knocking on the door in the night to round up people who wanted to choose their own government. Humor was a recipe of some comfort. What is a secure border of the Soviet Union? We used to ask ourselves in those days. Secure border of the Soviet Union is a border that has Soviet soldiers on both sides of it. Today, Poland's security situation could not be more different, thanks in good part to the leadership of the United States. Poland is now free of those terrors. Poland has been a member of the North Atlantic Alliance for over a decade. Later this year, Poland takes over the EU presidency for the first time, an amazing transformation for those who have lived through it. Now others want their freedom too. Events in Egypt and Libya are grabbing the headlines, and quite right. But let's not forget the 20 years after the Berlin Wall, that there is still some unfinished democracy business in Europe. Cyprus, Kosovo, Bosnia, frozen conflicts in Transnistria, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and Nagorno-Karabakh, integrating Ukraine, Moldova, and the Balkans into the Euro-Atlantic community. Last but not least, the disgraceful Belarusian dictatorship right on Poland's borders. Dictatorship which lets out political prisoners from jail only after having tortured them and extorted a promise to spy on fellow opposition colleagues. That's exactly what happened in the last few days to Mr. Ales Michalewicz. Belarus is still an effective dictatorship. It's a place where they do have elections, but the elections are rigged to get one so-called winner, President Lukashenko, Europe's famous answer to Colonel Gaddafi. Belarus is militarily integrated with Russia. Together, they count 1 million troops. While Belarus is pretending that the Cold War is still alive and well, Poland has moved on. We take defense seriously, spending about 2% of our GDP on defense. We have gained important modern warfare experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. Within a decade, our defense system should deter any conventional adversary, including even as scary a figure as President Lukashenko. But what about unconventional adversaries? These days, they pop up as if from nowhere. Pirates on the high seas, religious fanatics with laptops skulking in faraway caves. Before doing my current job, I had the honor to serve as Poland's Minister of Defense. So I know about just how hard it is to plan against these exotic new threats. They say that the problem with generals is that they always want to fight the last war, not the next one. But what if you can't begin to imagine what the next war will look like, or where it'll come from? It may be invisible. You suddenly realize that your key national infrastructure has been deliberately infected with killer computer viruses, launched at the speed of light from somewhere on the other side of the planet. And everything just stops. Dealing with this sort of thing requires fast, clever, cutting-edge cooperation around the world between friends that you can really trust. And at the heart of making that happen is the US-European relationship. In this unpredictable world you are inheriting, there are some core realities. First and foremost, Europe is at peace. Let's remember when it wasn't, and what that cost your country. In June 1944, American Rangers, just the age of some of you, and maybe the grandfathers and great-grandfathers of people at Harvard today, started climbing the cliffs of Normandy under intense fire from the Nazi defenders. They climbed those cliffs to rescue Europe from its own extremism. Ronald Reagan's famous speech on those same cliffs in 1984 described what happened. They climbed, shot back, and held their footing. Soon, one by one, the Rangers pulled themselves over the top. In seizing the firm land at the top of these cliffs, they began to seize back the continent of Europe. That heroic success laid the foundation for what we have today, the huge power and energy of the US-European relationship. The EU-US transatlantic flows of trade and investment amount to about $1 billion per day. That's a lot of money, even by Harvard standards. Together, we represent over 50% of global GDP. Whatever China, India, and Brazil may do, that massive dynamic relationship is not going to go away any day soon. And it needs protecting. Not surprisingly, the United States is asking Europe to shoulder some of the burden. As seen from the outside, the European Union spends an inordinate amount of time closely examining its own entrails and stirring its alphabet soup of institutional acronyms. In Harvard, of all places, there's no point running away from awkward facts. Europe's fine-sounding declarations have not been matched by investments in defense. The combined military expenditure of EU member states fell from 2.1% of GDP in 1997 to 1.7% in 2009. That still makes about 250 billion euros, almost half of what the US spends, which would give us a great deal of military capability, provided the money was spent wisely. But the trend is down. Does that matter? I think it does, because when an urgent security job arises, and we Europeans struggle to find a few helicopters into battle, it doesn't look too good. But it is not the only thing that matters. The European Union does deliver wide-ranging and generous programs, generous development aid programs of more than $50 billion of annual value from the EU and member states. As Harvard's Joe Nye emphasizes, soft power is a precious commodity in today's world. The EU's ambitious and effective conflict prevention and state-building programs are making a major stabilizing impact across our continent and far beyond. In that context, a word about Russia, always a subject dear to any Pole's heart. As you may or may not know, Russia is the only country which celebrates its National Day on the anniversary of the expulsion of the Polish contingent from Moscow at the beginning of the 17th century. The idea of us being evil occupiers of Russia has its positive sides. President Obama came to office determined to make a new start with Moscow, to press that reset button in the US-Russia relations. And it has made a difference. A New START treaty has been concluded, paving the way for future arms reductions, and Poland has argued for addressing the imbalance in sub-strategic munitions, tactical nuclear warheads. The UN Security Council has got tougher on Iran, and logistic lines for Afghanistan have been improved and secured through Russia. However, the reset has somehow not yet included a change in Russia's attitude to the entire post-Soviet space, including parts of Europe itself. The Russia-Belarus joint 2009 military exercises on Poland's border were held under the provocative and ridiculous scenario of repelling an invasion by NATO. Russia's military doctrine, released last year, describes NATO enlargement as a threat, despite 14 years of friendly and mainly constructive NATO-Russia dialogue and cooperation. Does anybody in this room think that we, as the West, would have the folly or, quite frankly, the energy to attack Russia? Our Russian friends really need to chill out. And let me be quite clear where we stand. Planning European and global security without acknowledging Russia's important and legitimate role makes no sense. Poland is dedicated to good relations with Russia. Russia is our neighbor. We are working hard to resolve some sensitive historical issues, and there has been progress. Poland, for example, is at the forefront of easing EU travel restrictions for ordinary Russians. But as another Harvard professor, Karl Deutsch, puts it, a security community rests upon shared values. Democracy, markets, and the respect for rights of the individual, these are the values that define relations between Europe and America. Russia, along with many other former Soviet republics, still does not respect those values. Moscow hankers after something rather different. Managed democracy, which is fine as long as you're one of the managers. Russia's attitude to different frozen conflicts in the former Soviet Union can politely be described as ambiguous. Russia has not used its huge influence to resolve even as tiny a problem as the one in Transnistria in Moldova. Moldova is just one of several European countries, along with Ukraine and Belarus, the lands between, that need our coordinated help to keep moving them to full and stable democracy. Secretary Clinton made this point strongly at last month's Munich conference. Europe, and by extension the United States, cannot be secure if parts of it are not secure. And some parts of Europe are insecure, which is why Poland and other Central and Eastern European countries welcome a continuing American political and military presence in Europe. We do not suffer from a perpetual insecurity complex. Rather, we know that the United States takes democracy seriously, not out of charity, but as a key strategic interest of its own. And that even in modern Europe, there are large areas of unfinished business where democracy still needs nurturing. The US military presence takes various forms. Missile defense infrastructure, Patriot batteries, joint exercises, and the proposed permanent US air detachment on Polish territory. Strategic reassurance also comes from non-military means. We value US support for the Eastern Partnership, which was devised by Poland and Sweden, and which is a priority of the Polish EU presidency. We were very grateful for the recent US contribution to a donors conference in Warsaw on solidarity with Belarus, a strong delegation with an offer of practical assistance to the civil society of Belarus. We also welcome the close attention the US pays to energy security in Europe. We support the diversification of suppliers and supply routes. The exploration of shale gas with US help creates many business opportunities and may end up reducing Poland's energy dependence. As American officials have stated many times, the US is looking for partners to share the burden of managing global security. Poland is happy to be one of those partners. We are serious about security. We know what it's like to be oppressed, to be prisoners in your own land. We know just how much your country and this university did to help us regain our freedom. Poland brings fresh ideas and fresh energy. Our men and women have joined most of the US's recent military missions, and without quibbling about national caveats, for example. We contribute to your security as you contribute to ours. And we are not in it to be a free rider. Now, as the stagnant status quo in North Africa is unraveling, the EU and the USA need once again urgently to find ways to work together, to promote peaceful change and a steady transition towards democracy, or at least some sort of honest pluralism. Dramatic events in Libya are accelerating as I speak. The US and Europe are putting intense pressure on the Gaddafi regime to stop the violence and step aside. Libya will need generous outside help building new democratic institutions. So will all sorts of other countries in the region. Only European countries working in the closest possible partnership with the United States and others, including Canada, can take on a job of this magnitude and give generous, fair-minded leadership. NATO is experiencing a new lease of life, having adopted a new strategic concept and missile defense as its core mission in Lisbon. It is there that it was declared that the EU is a unique and essential partner for NATO. We dare not fail, because if all these changes go badly wrong, and North Africa and the broader Middle East slumps into chronic, violent disarray, vital European and US security interests alike will be threatened far into the future. Your own lives will be a lot less happy as a result. Poland has a long and tough experience in this sort of transition. We know about dismantling dirty secret police structures and opening the dark archives of repression. We know about setting up a market economy, setting up honest banks. We know about building the rule of law from scratch. We are ready and willing to share this experience with Belarus, with North Africa, and anywhere else where it's needed. Tomorrow in Washington, I'll be discussing how best to take all this forward. There's really no time to waste. With so many dramatic and uncertain changes speedily occurring in the world, and above all, across the Middle East and Asia, no country, big or small, can afford to abandon its traditional friendships, especially when those friendships, like the friendship between the United States and Europe, are founded in shared values and colossal shared interests. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, let me open the floor. Minister Sikorski agreed to accept questions, so please.
Yes. Mr. Sikorski, you speak of dangerous ideas, recognition of human rights inside in Poland, in the United States, and in Europe. How do you reconcile the fact that up to now there has been no resolution of property rights in Poland? That is to say, reprisalization, the return of property that was confiscated and stolen by the communist regime. And this stuff is still in the Polish treasury. How do you counter it? Will there be a resolution? There's a Swiss saying, "Ama abor." A man is only as good as his word. When Tusk came to power, even before, he said that he would resolve this question as a priority. And he's been there almost for 4 years, and he broke his word. Now, how can businesses invest in Poland if they can't rely on the word of its leader? And there's a lot of old folks out there, believe me, with a line, waiting for some resolution. And it hasn't come yet after 22 years. Do you have an answer for that?
If you ask the question, please introduce yourself briefly.
My name is Edward Willard. I was a student here 60 years ago. As a matter of fact, I wrote a dissertation on the Brzezinski.
Thank you very much.
To dictatorship in Poland between the war. And I was in the Department of Government, and I went to medicine and so forth.
Thank you very much. More questions? Yes, Tricia.
You mentioned the events in North Africa, particularly Libya, and the need of the EU to work together with the US. This is one of the biggest challenges facing European foreign policy since Lisbon has come into effect. Do you see the European Union as being able to effectively execute a common foreign policy?
I have one more question for this.
Sorry, I didn't quite get it.
North Africa, Libya, this is going to be a big foreign policy challenge both for the U.S. and the European Union. The European Union, particularly Mrs. Ashton, has been criticized as being a little bit behind the curve, behind Germany, behind the UK in terms of reacting, for example, to Egypt. Is this crisis going to be a test of the EU actor, basically?
My name is Ekiert. I'm a student in the college. I've been reading about the Polish military lately, and it seems that there's been sort of an increase in the average age. Does this somewhat signal the move towards soft power that you spoke of earlier, or do you see a regeneration of Poland's armed forces?
Should we take it in threes? Okay.
The Polish Catholic way.
Restitution. I'm happy to hand over to you the text of an agreement between Poland and the United States signed on the 29th of November 1960 about resolving claims and paying compensation. This has been, I have it in English if you want. I believe compensation was paid out, tens of millions, was shared among US citizens. And if there are some people who feel that's not enough, there is a process in Poland through the courts. Hundreds of people are receiving their properties back. But you do need to prove your claim. Poland also restored the communal property, for example, of the various denominations, including to the Jewish community, very generously. So I believe that this issue is on track, but I wouldn't get too many hopes up for U.S. citizens because, as I say, the issue was resolved in the 1960s. As regards Baroness Ashton being behind the curve, you know, she needs to coordinate the positions of 27 countries. If she, I think particularly as she's yet at the stage of securing the position and the authority of the office of the High Representative, she can't afford much criticism. So I think she's doing the right thing, because if she acted more speedily, she would be criticized, and that would be worse. But yes, it's a very tough test, and I expect to be fully occupied in helping Cathy Ashton when the Polish presidency starts, and I'll be acting as her deputy on some issues. But we are dealing with a crisis of unprecedented proportions. How unexpected this is, I think, is best evidenced by the fact that the US was able to freeze today Gaddafi's assets in the US, which apparently amounts to $30 billion. Well, that shows you that someone who should have known about the situation in his own country certainly didn't expect this to happen so quickly. We have the challenge of finding solutions that will work in those countries themselves, because the one thing that we certainly cannot afford is some kind of huge wave of migration.
The third question, there was the third question.
And the third question about the Polish military getting old. Well, we've just abandoned the draft. And so when you abandon the draft, the average age necessarily rises because 18-year-olds are no longer serving in the military. We now have a professional army of 100,000, and sure, it's a little older, but it's, with modern equipment, it just makes more sense to keep soldiers in the army for a few years rather than for 12 months. I believe it's the move in the right direction, because we don't expect a war in defense of Poland anytime soon. We now defend not our independence, we defend our interests. And our interests are sometimes beyond our borders. And for that, you need a volunteer army. Sending conscripts on missions abroad just doesn't work anymore. And also, the conscript system was actually a corrupting system on civic behavior, because so many people got out of the draft, but they got out through unfair means, you know, fake medical certificates or other ways. So the first contact that a young person had with the state at the age of 18 or 19 was to cheat it. Not good. And at the same time, in every population, you have about 10–15% of boys and girls, fewer, but girls also, who love this stuff, who love the service. And we want those kind of people in our army.
I would like to refer to President Obama's speech before he became a president in Berlin. He was inviting European politicians to the dialogue in the future when he will become a president, how to deal with the present, how to deal with the problems of security worldwide. I would like to ask you now, we have a chance to propose some scenarios right now, because Poland is going to have a presidency in Europe. Do we have some scenarios in Poland?
Some what?
Scenarios.
What do you mean by that?
Some propositions how to engage European countries and US
I'm not sure I intellectually follow.
As I said, President Obama, when he was giving a political speech in Berlin, was inviting Europe to deal with security problems worldwide, inviting politicians in Europe, so that the United States is not alone in dealing with all the problems.
Okay.
And now Poland is going to have a presidency in Europe, so the question is, do we have something to propose, how to engage other European countries and US together in dealing with security problems on global stage which are present?
Okay, great. I'm afraid we don't have mics, so if you could speak loudly enough for everyone to hear, that would be great. Madam, I saw your head. No, it's stationary, so it would be very difficult.
What about this one?
That may be this is very...
Ah, sorry.
Okay. Madam, could you speak up, please?
Our government still respect the law from the communism government. Why we respect so big attention? Why we don't respect, for example, the law from the first our government in London? They have organized also some law.
Thank you.
What particular law do you have in mind?
No, the
Okay, gotcha.
Okay, thank you. Volga.
My question is about Belarus. You singled it out as a big problem in Europe, and it seems that a lot of attention, a lot of aid to civil society support has been directed that way, but in the last maybe years, nothing has been achieved. I was wondering if you also see it this way, if some of European different approaches were counterproductive at all, or if some actually worked. What do you see as the more productive approach, and also how do you evaluate the efforts of Belsat broadcasting in Belarus? Belsat broadcasting in Belarus from Belarus.
Gotcha.
Europe seems to be at a bit of a crossroads at the moment, where the countries can become more deeply integrated, or they can expand and start to add more countries like Turkey, and probably have a more superficial relationship. I'm curious to know what Poland's attitude towards this is. And considering sort of rejection of the constitution among many of the member states, I think there does seem to be a move to being more superficial. Does this counter a lot of your claims about the importance of Europe in the world, for its world position?
Well, why don't I start at the end again? I think you're right that the economic crisis will force us into greater economic integration, and that will make, not to speed, because there are many speeds in Europe, but it will, not my fault. Countries belong to various circles of integration. It's not a speedy part and periphery. You know, countries are in Schengen or outside Schengen. Some are in the EU, in the Eurozone, others are not. But there are other less well-known ones. Some countries are neutral, otherwise. Some are in NATO and not. I believe it's Poland's political interest to be in the Eurozone. As regards economic interest, we shall see. We need to pick the right moment. We need to be closely integrated because we are actually economically very integrated, particularly with Germany. something like 60% of our trade is with Germany. Germany is by far our biggest trading partner. And that's not the case for all European countries. We also rather like this idea of moving without changing place from Eastern Europe to Central Europe and now to Northern Europe. The fact that we are a desired member of the Eurozone is a new experience for us. You know, we are seen as a country that is responsible for its finances with a successful economy. That's, but yes, there will be countries that are semi-detached from Europe. Yeah. There's Norway, for example, economically completely integrated. Its elites would actually like to be inside the European Union, but their people just won't vote for it because they have to live by European norms that they don't have influence on shaping. Switzerland. Switzerland's independence of the EU is about 6 months, because that's how long it takes for them to have to adopt EU legislation into internal law. Turkey is different, as you know. There's simply no consensus yet on including Turkey. And then Britain is an interesting case because I believe Britain will probably never join the Eurozone, but it's odd because Britain has actually won most of its battles in Europe. You know, Europe has become an English-speaking federation, which was not a foregone conclusion 30 years ago. The single market was a British idea. And now Britain is running Europe's diplomacy. If she wanted to, Britain could be in charge of Europe's integrated defense policy as well. But Britain doesn't seem to want it, which I think is a shame, actually. So you risk that at the intersection of these various groupings, there will be a core of countries, and they will have more influence. The periphery will have to adjust. Belarus. Well, it's been 16 years since Alexander Lukashenko has taken power. I hope he follows on what's going on in Libya in particular. And I hope he concludes that compared with that alternative, a dialogue with the opposition is better for everyone, including himself. And that's exactly what we were trying to tell him last year as Europe and actually as Poland and Germany together. I traveled to Minsk with Guido Westerwelle, and we made Lukashenko an offer: run a free election, and we will put together an assistance package somewhat similar to what we did for Moldova. And I'm very proud that we did that, because that means that we are sure that he had an offer. Because if we hadn't done it, together we would, today we could be criticized. Oh, if only you'd made him an offer. But we did, and he still made the wrong choice. But as you know, he is sustained from outside. It looked hopeful last year. Quite frankly, Russia was sending all the signals that they are sick of Lukashenko and that they would be prepared to accept a democratic outcome. But then they changed their mind at the last minute. But it still was the right policy, I believe, because, and Belarusian dissidents thank me for it, because it gave them a year of thaw, a year of slightly better conditions. Last year, there were no political prisoners in Belarus, and the election was a little bit better than before. The candidates could debate one another on live television. but bigger budgets were allowed for campaigning, and people could actually canvass for votes in the streets. I know it doesn't seem like much, but it's quite a lot by Belarusian standards. So the election was better until the vote counting. And then, of course, you know, there is a debate whether it was rigged by 30 or by 40%. But not even the Russians. I have not yet met anybody who believes Lukashenko's announced result of 80%. And in fact, I believe that he cracked down precisely because he knows that he lost. Because in the past he won but added votes for good measure. This time he really lost. And that's why he overreacted. Bielsat, I think, is a good thing, but it's costing us quite a bit of money, and its penetration is not satisfactory. It reaches about 5% of the population, and it costs us about 20 million per annum. So they need to make a bigger effort. They made the judgment that they should not be a force for further Russifying the Belarusian population. So they broadcast in Belarusian. But not everybody in Belarus understands Belarusian. So there is an argument which says that they should have subtitles in Russian, or vice versa. But they need to increase their penetration. And why we respect the communist laws and not those of London? Well, I was in exile in London myself, and of course, it's true that the London Poles preserved the constitutional legality, continuity of pre-war Poland. I would have been perfectly happy for the April Constitution, the pre-war Constitution, to have been restored. Some of the Baltic states did that. They restored their pre-war constitutions. The pre-war Polish Constitution envisages very strong presidential powers, which has its advantages and disadvantages. As you know, in some of the post-Soviet countries, very strong presidential powers have actually led to over-concentrations of power. So that's an argument against. You know, the communist Poland was an internationally recognized Polish state for 45 years, whether we like it or not. And therefore I was against it, but the exit from communism was done by negotiation and was done gradually. And I would have preferred to have seen a more distinct break with the communist past. I agree with the sentiment. Whether it could have been done through adopting the pre-war constitution, there was simply no consensus on it. It's, you know, there are advantages and disadvantages to revolution. You know, it was one of your first presidents, Thomas Jefferson, who said that the tree of liberty should be watered with the blood of tyrants and patriots. And in 1989, there were no crowds in the streets. There was no mass rejoicing at the regaining of liberty. There was no moment of catharsis. And it matters. I think Polish politics is still very fraught and full of frustration because people never felt that moment of liberation. We still argue about when communism ended. Was it the round table negotiations? Was it the moment of the partially free elections? Was it the moment of the presidential elections? Yeah. We don't know when to celebrate. So I agree, an opportunity was missed. But inevitably, some things you cannot undo. You know, I see it. You know, for example, this law that I've just that I showed you, this agreement with the United States. You know, in 1960s, getting $40 million out of the communists in compensation for US citizens who lost properties in Poland probably seemed like a good deal, because many communist countries were not paying any kinds of compensation at all. But, you know, today we are the successors to this agreement, and this has advantages and disadvantages.
Professor Pipes.
I just wanted to suggest the microphone.
Okay. Okay, sir.
Hi, I'm from private medical school. I have a question regarding Polish-American relationship. There seems to be a perception on this side of the pond that
I can hear.
Poland is a good and reliable ally. However, it comes across quite often as a needy ally. Is there a sort of strategy in your government, in government of Donald Tusk, to sort of change these perceptions whenever, you know, Polish dissidents come to US, we sort of whine about visas, we whine about patriots, we whine about this, that, and the other. However, we contribute strongly to overall US security by being in Iraq, being in Afghanistan. So my question exactly is, do you have a strategy to sort of change this dynamic of this relationship to be more partner-like instead of being like a big brother, young brother?
Sir. Well, you should grab the mic.
The first question is whether Polish government is planning to introduce some, or is in fact working on introduction of some preferential visas to Ukrainian, Belarusian, and possibly Russian citizens as a part of building mutual relationship and also civil societies in these countries. And the second question is, I would like to ask about the stage of the pan-European energy policy, and is that going to include an honest discussion of the necessity of atomic energy to be developed in Europe, and also in the light of the discoveries of the shale oil in Poland and many other countries, shale gas, sorry, is there are people going to address the recent worries that have been raised in United States about the fracking technique introducing too much diesel petrol into the groundwaters?
Thank you, madam.
You spoke about the relationship of democracy and security, and so I have two questions about that. The first one is about Ukraine. There have been some concerns expressed about the rule of President Yanukovych in Ukraine. So I was wondering how Poland will respond if Poland shares those concerns and what it will do about them. And the second question is about Russia. You talked about the fact that the European security architecture is based on shared values, and yet Russia doesn't share those values, but still has a legitimate and important role to play in it. So I was hoping you could tell us what role do you see for Russia in the European security architecture? Thank you.
As Poland has become such an important ally of the U.S., many Polish Americans, now there's some people in Poland as well, thought that Poland would, that the visa waiver program would extend to Poland, and it hasn't happened. So my question is, what is the Polish government and the foreign ministry's position on that issue, and is it doing anything to advance that issue with the U.S. government?
The US government, believe me, knows our position on the visa waiver program. Look, the US seems in reality to encourage immigration to the United States from Latin America and the Middle East rather than Central Europe. We are surprised, but we respect it. We are no longer in the business of supporting and encouraging Poles to leave Poland and to settle in the United States or to look for job opportunities here. Because Poles can now work legally in all of Europe, and they, with social protection and actually with higher wages than here. And when you're in Europe, in the same time zone, and in the same legal and borderless entity, it's much easier to keep in touch with your family, to keep in touch with Poland, and to pass on identity to your children. So you know, we want our people to return to Poland. And so if some people think that visa waiver program is to encourage people to come here and break US law, well, no, it shouldn't be. The issue is actually not that big a deal anymore, because when you get a US visa, you get it for 10 years. So it's unpleasant to have to queue, but if you have to do it, it's once a decade. It's actually a question of prestige, because Poland is the only country in the Schengen group that is still singled out like that, and we don't get it. Why? It is the only thing where in all the Western institutions is the only thing that distinguishes Poland from all the other European countries, and we just don't get it. Our soldiers are good enough to fight with Americans in Iraq and Afghanistan, but if those same soldiers try to come here for a reunion, some of them wouldn't get visas. But it's your government that has to work on it. Big brother, young brother. Well, you know, in diplomacy, we routinely talk about equality in relationships. And it's true that one of the basic tenets of international relations is that in protocol terms, all states are equal. I think it was originally established in the Congress of Vienna, in protocol terms. But in real reality, there is, of course, a difference in power relationships. And Poland is a country of 38 million people with a GDP of, depending how you count, about $700 billion. And the US has what, 300 million? Or is it 400 by now? 300 million. And an economy of about $14 trillion. When you compare military budgets, the disparity is even bigger. So it's not going to be by comparison with the US, practically all European countries are smallish. So if we want to have an equal relationship with the United States, we can only have it as Europe. And I think it's tending that way, and I think the US is reconciled to that. I think the US is even encouraging Europe to become more cohesive and to get its act together. And I think it's a good thing. No, I think that in the relationship with the US, we need to find ourselves useful to each other on specific issues. And the US, we need the US in the security field. But I think the US needs us more in the democracy promotion field, where we have assets that the US doesn't. For example, many countries around the world are more willing to take advice on democratization from a comparable country, such as ourselves, a country that doesn't have a superiority complex towards the world and is not feared or doesn't give anybody complexes. We have a recent history of being a basket case, and we have lifted ourselves out of it. So we can inspire other people. Whereas people think, well, the US is special, the US is big, the US is different. So here is a Polish-American project. The US has the global reach, we have the technology. where we can help each other. And then this energy business is I think, promising because we have the deposits of shale gas. The US has the technology of hydraulic fracturing and of horizontal drilling. There will be a reaction to shale gas because current producers want to keep their share of the market, and we are talking about a business that's worth hundreds of billions. So to spend a few million on a campaign that shows that shale gas is the greatest environmental threat to mankind is cheap. And it will be done, and it is being done. From what I know, the overwhelming experience in the United States is positive. Europe is more densely populated, so there will be some challenges. But I think companies that are prospecting and want to benefit from it need to invest a bit in advance public policy to explain the technology, the challenges and the threats. Preferential visas for Belarusians, Ukrainian Russians. One of the decisions I made after the 19th of December crackdown in Belarus, I waived visa fees for Belarusians, for Polish national visas. I cannot waive the fees for Schengen visas because that's an EU decision. And it's actually even sillier than that because it's an EU decision that has to be negotiated with the country that is affected. So to do something for the Belarusian people, as the regulations stand right now, we need the permission of Lukashenko, which is why I'm convincing my European colleagues that we should start behaving like a proper big power, namely start granting privileges. Not only visa privileges, also trade privileges, without negotiation. Just do it one-sidedly. We can afford it. With Ukrainians, we have 16 categories of people that get Polish national visas for free. I've just lowered the price for the others from 35 to 20. Schengen visas, I believe, are cheaper already. And we have introduced a local border traffic agreement. People living in the band of 30 to 50 kilometers on each side of the border can actually travel without visas. And Poland is at the spearhead of arguing for visa liberalization for Eastern Partnership countries, and also for Russians, as long as conditions are met. They need to have biometric passports, they need to have databases of passports issued, they need to delineate and effectively control their borders, they need to conclude readmissions agreements with the EU and with their neighbors. Provided those technical details are fulfilled, we are in favor of liberalizing visa policy, and in particular, believe it or not, Poland and Russia are jointly pressuring the EU and some member countries to allow the local border traffic agreement to encompass the entire Kaliningrad Oblast, which is, because otherwise it would have to be divided into zones, which doesn't make any sense. Yes, we believe that the best democracy promotion is for people of those countries to come and see that democracy works. Pan-European energy policy, nuclear. Well, you know, it's a bit of a racket because nuclear is only economical when CO2 emissions certificates are above 15 euros. So it only makes sense in this artificial world of of reductions of CO2 emissions, which only obtains in Europe and not in those parts of the world where polluting and emissions are still growing. Poland is the country in Europe which has reduced CO2 emissions more than anybody else. We have reduced by 30% in the last 20 years, which means that it's very difficult for us to keep reducing because we've already done it. Western Europe hasn't done it to the same extent. And God has given us coal. God has given others gas or oil. We have coal, and so it's very expensive for us to make the transition. Ukraine, concerns about democracy. We've just had our annual Poland-Ukraine foreign ministry leaderships, not just ministers, but leaderships, consultations, and Ukraine is sliding in the various indexes of freedom, democracy, corruption perceptions, and so on. And I told, frankly, our Ukrainian partners that this is going to make it harder for them to conclude beneficial agreements with Europe. They argue back, saying that this is the opposition besmirching the new president abroad, but perceptions do affect reality. You know, when government ministers seek and obtain political asylum in EU countries, that means something is not quite right. As far as Russia is concerned, well, the trouble is that we in the West are perfectly happy with the architecture of European security. NATO for territorial security, and some expeditions, EU developing slowly as a secondary insurance policy, OSCE for some hard and some soft issues, Council of Europe for soft issues. Well, Russia is not happy with the architecture because she doesn't have veto powers in some of those institutions. But our answer to that is, well, Russia could join some of those institutions. She just has to fulfill the criteria. And the criteria are democracy, democratic control over the army, settling disputes with neighbors, and so on. So it's hard because we want Russia encompassed within our perimeter and be a global partner for us, but not at any price. So either Russia makes the transition and becomes Western, and then she can fit into our architecture, or we need to negotiate the terms.
Please join me in thanking Minister Sikorski for this lecture and for those very candid answers to your question. Thank you very much.